Thanks everybody. Thanks very much for coming. I can see a few familiar faces here, so thanks for coming. You're all very welcome. Um, this is the lunch briefing series. It's co-hosted by the Voxpol Network of Excellence and European Commission representation in Belgium. Um, this is the fifth of six sessions. We've had 4 sessions so far, a couple of sessions which have presented new research, and a couple of sessions which have given an overview, a EU state of play for topics. And this session today is going to be some new research, presenting some more new research. I'll introduce our speaker Zoe in a minute, but first I just want to say that the live stream is on. It's just pointing at us. I'll turn it off when the presentation's over and before the Q&A, so you can all speak freely later. What else was I going to say? Oh yes. We have Twitter handles and Twitter hashtags, so it's interactive. All the talks we stay on our YouTube page, so you're free to share them and view them. Our final session is next week, and it is the launch of a new report. So it'd be great to see you there as well. But today we're hearing from Zoe. So Zoe Reeve is a researcher specializing in terrorism, extremism, and social behavioral science. She's currently lecturing at Newcastle University. She's responsible for the postgraduate training courses on quantitative data analysis for social science research. Zoe's a Voxpol Research Fellow. She's recently published in the Journal of Terrorism and Political Violence with the experimental paper that we're presenting today, and that I think you got a copy of on your way in. She's also the author of a new an upcoming Voxpol report that should be out probably early next year. And it's investigating the mental health and well-being of counter-terrorism internet referral unit officers in the UK. I think that some of that research will also be covered here today. I'm giving a quick introduction so we can get on with the presentation. There'll be about 50 minutes, and then we'll have some question and answer and some lunch. So thanks very much, and the floor is yours. So,
Hi everyone, thank you for being here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research today, and that research looks very broadly at engaging with extremist material. And I do this in a few different ways. So I'm going to talk you through 3 projects that I worked on as a Voxpol Research Fellow, and they are on various stages of publication. So I'm going to start by very briefly overviewing some of the links between the internet and radicalisation and terrorism. And then I will focus on 3 of my main projects. The first looks at extremist content, the second looks at how viewers interact and engage with extremist content, and the third looks at how practitioners engage and with extremist content. And I'll finish up by pulling some core themes together and provide one policy suggestion. But before I get into it, I really wanted to kind of give you a bit of an overview of how I see these 3 projects meeting in the middle, if you like. So this is the kind of model that I'm working with. So I want to understand how extremist content might work to try and influence towards viewer engagement and interaction with the material and the cause. I want to test viewer engagement, so look at how people engage and interact with the content, and are there any differences between people who do and don't interact with that content. And finally, I want to understand practitioner engagement, so what do they do with terrorist content, and why do they do it, and also how does that terrorist content affect them. So there's been a lot of great work that's been done, particularly by Voxpol, just to plug in there, that looks into the role of the internet and terrorism. But I think it's worthwhile noting that it can be really difficult to do this research. Firstly, because radicalisation, for instance, is a really complex process and it is experienced differently by different people. But also online research has its own challenges as well, least of all doing research on the dependent variable. So basically that means that we only have access to the data that is available. So if someone is interacting with an extremist webpage, for instance, then great, we've got that data, but what we don't have is data from people who may have seen the website but not interacted with it. So we're only getting a sliver of the picture here. There are a few things that we know in general though. So we know that people who do engage in terrorism these days are very likely to abuse the internet. But that's not really saying very much because we all use the internet all the time. However, there are some ways that the internet is useful, particularly for terrorism. So it's typically known as a facilitative tool in terrorism and radicalization. On one hand, terrorists use the internet instrumentally, again, the same way that we would, logistics, booking travel tickets, Google Maps, whatnot. They might also be using it to learn how to make bombs as well, which hopefully we're not doing. So there's different ways that terrorists will use the internet in an instrumental way. It's also naturally an excellent communicative tool. The terrorists or would-be terrorist people in general can learn about different types of ideology. They can view propaganda and share, distribute extremist material and rhetoric. And most importantly, create links and maintain links where those links never would have been possible otherwise. Some people argue even that thanks to the mass distribution of terrorist material, the propaganda, instruction, and whatnot, membership to terrorist groups is essentially now decided by the individual who engages with that material. So it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. Can you see that spider running around? It's okay. It's just distracting me. Right, where was I? Oh, distracted by an insect. It's like not even big. It's just really bulbous. Anyway. What was I talking about? So the idea that terrorist membership and involvement is now somehow linked to the individual deciding that they're going to be part of that process is quite an important one, and I think it also supports this assumption that the internet can and does have a direct impact on offline terrorism. So there is this idea also that online extremist material is harm because it enables or promotes offline terrorism in different ways. So through recruitment or mobilization, via funding, or even, as I said, committing the acts of terrorism themselves. So this justifies to some extent the removal of terrorist material. But as I said, I think this justification is also to some degree based on an assumption that those people who view terrorist material are somehow radicalized by it passively. And really what the research is suggesting is that it's actually an interaction between the user and the material. And it's the interaction that varies according to the user's own circumstances, to their own attitudes, their ideas, their identity, their own experiences. So although the internet's used by terrorists or potential terrorists or people generally in the same way as anyone else according to their needs and their interests, but it does mean that we should be trying to understand the interaction between the individual, the user, and the material, because that's potentially a really important feature for understanding online radicalization. And this is what I try and do with my research. So I do this in three different ways, as I said before, by addressing these three different questions. So firstly, I'm interested in understanding what it is about extremist propaganda that might be influencing features that are associated with the radicalization process. Now, I say features that are associated with the radicalization process because I find it much more useful to break down radicalization into its various components, to think about how the material might be tapping into those different features, which may then have an impact on some of the influence in terms of engagement. The second question is looking at how, to what extent people engage with and interact with the extremist material. But as I mentioned before, it's actually really quite difficult to investigate this because the data that we have online is quite one-sided. So I had to be kind of imaginative to try and get around that problem. And thirdly, I wanted to know how material is engaged with by practitioners. So how the material is identified as being a terrorist, how it's removed, and also what the impact that repeated and extensive exposure to this type of material can have on practitioners. And as Louise mentioned, this is part of the reports that will be coming out next year, and the practitioners in this case are the UK Metropolitan Police Counter-Terrorism Internet Referral Unit, and I'll be referring to them as CTRU, okay, Counter-Terrorism Internet Referral Unit. So this is kind of a spoiler alert. My research in general suggests that extremist content provides important and useful information to shed light on identity construction of terrorists, and really how they hope to influence the identity of sensitive viewers. The viewer engagement varies, with most people not interacting at all, and I'll explain more how I got to that conclusion. And also, there are actually features of terrorist material that can be disengaging, so that actually work to push people away. In terms of practitioner engagement, the decision-making process is not particularly transparent. It is very subjective, and naturally, repeated and extensive exposure to really horrible material does have some negative impacts, but these negative impacts can be nicely mitigated by certain coping mechanisms and really good support from supervisors and management. So that was the introduction. Now I'm going to start telling you about the studies. The first study I'm going to tell you about is one that I conducted, which involved a lot of intense watching of and analysis of terrorist videos to investigate the content of that material. And for anyone who has not watched terrorist videos, don't. It's not fun. It's not a good thing to do. Useful for research though. Now, a lot of research has been done that looks at content of terrorist propaganda in its various forms. There is a general agreement that it typically serves to communicate ideology, threat, dehumanization, perceptions of threat, blame, etc. And typically we understand terrorist material as kind of forming a mobilizing frame. So the material provides a way for individuals to understand the events that or the situation that is problematic, and also acts to guide viewers towards some kind of radical behavior. And sometimes this material is even designed to target certain viewers. Usually that's young males, particularly in certain countries where the material might be homing in on particular country-based grievances to try and draw those vulnerable viewers in. Terrorist material clearly tries to trigger emotions and motivations, like vengeance particularly, and promote other ways of engaging with the material and participating in the cause. But I think it's important to point out that participation doesn't necessarily need to be violent, and it's not always violent, particularly with ISIS, believe it or not. And once again, I think it's really important to acknowledge that people don't tend to passively absorb terrorist material, or at least we don't have evidence that they do passively absorb material. And also, we really shouldn't be conflating the presumed goals of terrorist propaganda producers in radicalizing, recruiting and mobilizing with the actual outcome of radicalization, recruitment and mobilization. My interest here is looking at how terrorist propaganda videos might try to promote engagement and participation in terrorist groups via identity construction. So the focus on this project was how looking at how terrorist material understands and promotes who the in-group is, and how members of that in-group should think and behave, rather than looking specifically at ideology. And the broad finding is that terrorist material provides guidance and information to help viewers to construct their own identities, should those viewers be sensitive or vulnerable or basically interacting with that material. Now, theoretically, I'm not going to spend too long on this, but I do draw on social psychology, particularly social identity theory. I think that social identity really underlies and enables the radicalization process. So I think that social identity is a component of the radicalization process. Now, a social identity is essentially a process, and we all engage with that process all of the time, and it's triggered in intergroup contexts. When social identity is triggered, we think and perceive and act as group members, or at least how we think good group members should think, perceive, and act. And we're also motivated to bias towards our in-groups and against our out-groups to some degree. And we do this via a process of positive differentiation. And that's basically because we all like to belong to high-status groups. It makes us feel good. And this is a really important point. We're all motivated to either increase low-status groups or maintain high-status groups. And there are different ways to attain high status via positive differentiation, which is this in-group out-group bias. But the most relevant here is social competition, which will hopefully be a bit more clear as we go along. So essentially from this perspective, terrorist material is important, I think, because we can ascertain a terrorist's understanding of the in-group that they're trying to promote in viewers, how they're trying to encourage particular perceptions of an out-group, how they perceive threats, and also how they want to resolve that threat. So identity information in this case can really help guide the way an individual or viewer understands and engages with that social identity. So this is still a mobilizing frame. It's a different way of looking at it rather than focusing on ideology. So methodologically, I mentioned before that I conducted some video analyses. This was qualitative, and it was very in-depth qualitative thematic analysis. So there are not a huge number of videos, and frankly, I didn't want to do any more terrorist video watching after this because it's quite grim. I pulled out 4 themes. Oh wait, I should tell you what the groups are. The groups that I looked at are ISIS for the jihadi material, and National Action and the Atomwaffen Division. I never know how to say that. The AWD. And this formed a comparative analysis. And there are 4 themes that I'm going to talk to you about. IG is in-group, OG is out-group, and perceptions of threat and solution. So both groups see themselves as warriors, unsurprisingly, and they're all fighting for the benefit of their respective groups. Both of the groups are really honing it in on and emphasizing their own superiority. So for the jihadi videos, the superiority comes from Allah and from their adherence to Islam. For the far right groups, unsurprisingly, the superiority comes from their race and sometimes nationality. Both of the groups see themselves as warriors, as I said before, and there's actually quite a lot of overlap in the types of descriptors and attributes and values that they use to identify who they are or who they want to be. But there are some important distinctions as well. Unsurprisingly, ISIS material focuses a lot on the conflict in Syria, and also the associated needs for discipline and patience and structure, being in a war zone. But the far right groups are far less coordinated, and they're kind of more like a band of rebels than anything else. And I think this is really reflecting the different types of groups that they are and the different stages of development of both groups. And another distinction is that the ISIS or jihadi material is really very, very clear and consistent as well about understanding what the in-group is. And that clarity is really missing from the far-right material. So the far-right, they know that they're concerned about race, but we're never really sure if they're only concerned about race, if they're also concerned about nationality or political classes. It's quite, they're a bit confused if you look at their material. Both groups are also concerned by threat to or lack of status. For ISIS, the lack of status is unjust, and it's related to the prevention of Islam's dominance in the world, and also this related perception of slaughter and oppression of Muslims and Islam. For the far right, the threat is to the status that they enjoy as white men, and that's the problem there, so the erosion of white privilege and dominance. Both groups very effectively use visuals to present these threats. ISIS, we all know that they're really good at presenting some really awful, grim material that focuses on dead and dying people, grieving civilians and whatnot. But the far right are actually really good at showing videos and stills of huge numbers of non-white people, refugees. They try and give an impression of territorial and cultural encroachment, which is hordes of people descending on an area that usually isn't even in Europe. But they take that material to try and present this threat. The other thing they do is show videos of non-white people attacking vulnerable white people, so women, children, elderly. Both groups focus on mortality salience, and they talk about genocide. Mortality salience is essentially when you're trying to think about death. And in terror management theory, which is in social psychology, basically you can predict that if you're trying to think about death, then you're going to bias towards your in-group and against your out-group. So there is some mortality salience is quite important in terrorist videos. So, as mentioned before, ISIS are really quite clear about who the in-group is, what kind of attributes and values they have, and actually a lot of those attributes and values are quite good qualities to have generally anyway. Um, in terms of the behaviours that the jihadi videos promote to be a good group member, of course, there's going to be focus on violence, joining the conflict in Syria to promote and to establish the caliphate, waging terrorism elsewhere if you can't get to Syria, martyring yourself, all of those things. But they do also include lots of non-violent behaviour as well. So there's a focus on prayer and charity, on taking care of others, believe it or not, living in peace and a peaceful and pious life, worshipping God. The far right, however, are really not very clear about the kind of behaviour that they think a good in-group member should be engaging in. And this is partly because their message is so unclear. And they really don't have a very strong idea of who the in-group is. So they talk about spreading their message, which is presumably that the white race is under attack. But this is never actually made particularly explicitly clear, so you kind of have to guess it yourself. So ISIS are really clear about who they are, who the in-group is and who they should aspire to be, and what kind of violent and non-violent behaviours they should engage with. But the far right really aren't. So they're not very clear about who they are. I should mention that actually, I should put dates on this, but I looked at these videos a couple of years ago. The far right have gotten better since then, probably now actually. So in terms of the outgroup, ISIS are also pretty good at identifying who the outgroup is. It's still a vague outgroup, but essentially the outgroup is everything that the in-group is not. There's a very, very clear divide right down the middle. The far right, again, are quite confused. The threat seems to come from territorial and cultural encroachment from the whites, which I mentioned before. But the real enemy, and therefore the outgroup, presumably, are the people who are behind the system, which is something that the far right talk about a lot. And that's probably, let's face it, going to consist of white men. So their in-group is white men, but their out-group is also white men. It's a bit confusing. Both groups do have a special hatred for traitors. For ISIS, these are people who don't adhere to Islam in the way that they do, the rejectors. For the far right, again, these are the liberals, the politicians, they were traitors to the white race, the white men. And again, you see associations with disease and filth and other things, that general dehumanization. But ISIS take dehumanization to the next level. I'm sure no one's surprised by this. The far right will talk about dehumanization, and they'll say some pretty horrible things, but ISIS actually do dehumanization in all the material that you see with the brutal and graphic killing, particularly the desecration of the dead. And this sends a really strong message to the viewers as both a warning and a success, depending on who the viewer is. But I think the desecration of the bodies is also an important part of dehumanization, because it shows that the dead are not even awarded any kind of dignity or peace even when they're dead, you know. The bodies are desecrated, they're even played with, some of them have used their heads as puppets or bowling balls. It's really quite grim. And the point I really wanted to make is that this is a real sharp contrast to the way that the dead and dying jihadis are treated, because they're treated with care and compassion and an awful lot of respect. Superiority is the solution and also the kind of problem for both of the groups. For jihadis, it's the return of dominance of Islam and Allah in the form of establishing the caliphate and then spreading Islam, and that's going to resolve all the problems and all the threats that they face. And naturally, killing is justified to meet this end, and it's also a personal obligation. The far right, for their solution is to maintain their white superiority, to fight against equality and liberalism. But again, the way to achieve this is really not very clear. So I'm aware this is a really horrible diagram, but it's a useful diagram as well. So what this shows is the jihadi social identity information, and we can see that there's a very clear understanding of who the in-group is and who the out-group is. The threat to the in-group is very clearly the oppression of Islam, which is an unjustified low status. And the solution to this problem is to establish the caliphate, which is a direct change of status, a direct comparison between in-groups and out-groups, the Muslim in-group and the non-Muslim out-group, and dehumanization assists in that process. But as you can see, the similar diagram for the far right, it's much less clear They're not even really sure if they're white men. Well, they know that they're white men, but their outgroup is also kind of white men because they're not really sure who that is. And that makes the threat, although they know it's the erosion of white dominance, it makes the threat also unclear because where is that threat coming from? And that also means that the solution is quite unclear, yet they still use dehumanization. So who's the competition with? They're not really sure. So essentially what I think this research is showing is that extremist content can give us a lot of insight into how terrorist groups understand themselves and their situation. And that could potentially provide a potential guiding framework for sensitive viewers towards a similar identity construction. But some of the groups are better than others, and in this case, ISIS are very clear about who they are, but the far right are not very. The far right that I looked at were not very good at this. But whether the clarity or the lack of clarity influences how people engage and interact with the material is something that I haven't looked into, and I think it's something that could probably be quite useful done in future research. One thing I want to hammer home is that I am not suggesting that the material itself is radicalizing, but that is possibly tapping into features like social identity that may underlie elements of the radicalization process by providing guidance on identity construction. So the research isn't talking about the viewers or viewer interaction, just how the material might be tapping into and influencing those normal psychological processes. The next study that I'm talking about does focus on the viewer in terms of engagement and interaction with extremist propaganda, and that's the study that you would have all been given as you kind of came in. And what I'm trying to do with this study is to understand more about the sensitive or the vulnerable viewer, so those people who might be drawn into engaging with or interacting with terrorist material. And the research question is very broad. I've already said it a couple of times already. So how and to what extent do people engage and interact with online extremist propaganda? And as I said before, this kind of research is really difficult to do because of the challenges of doing research on a dependent variable. But there are ways around this, and I chose to design an experiment in order to bypass this problem, if you like. I'm not going to spend too long talking about the experiment, but you can either read it or ask me about it later on if you want. The experiment was an online study, but it was kind of a lab-based because I had chosen my participants. There were 70 UCL student participants. The UCL identity is important because I built all of the material around that UCL identity. I did design my own extremist propaganda, and I gave it to students to see what would happen. And I did get ethical approval for this. Again, happy to tell you all about that if you like. The web page that I designed was from the perspective of an extremist group that is only extremist because it's not a prescribed group because I made it up. I basically used the research that I've done with the video analysis and all my previous experience of dealing with terrorist material to design a web page that reflects terrorist material, terrorist propaganda. So it's all fictional, but it is also quite realistic. I also included some independent variables. The prime independent variable is mortality salience. Just a reminder, that's when you're trying to think about death and is associated with in-group bias and out-group hostility to some degree. Just a very quick bit about the extremist material that I designed. I built the web page around the UCL student identity. So that was the primary identity of all of this. I made up some grievances that basically took general standard student grievances about teaching and location and like space to study, things like that, and blamed them on, I gave a set of grievances that they could already relate to, let's say. The UCL students were the innocent and unjustly penalised in-group. There was an aggressive and dangerous but vague out-group, and this out-group was basically just non-UCL students, so really, really vague. The extremist group were self-styled defenders and they produced the material, and there was aggression and implied violence and some images in the material that they witnessed, they engaged with. So I was really trying to mimic the themes and tone and some of the images of terrorist material. And I provided different types of interaction tools, so these were form-dependent variables, so they could like or dislike the material, they could visit, like tick a box to visit websites, and they could explicitly provide their support, for instance. So these were the dependent variables in the study. I looked at likes and dislikes, online engagement, which if I show you this again, is basically adding all of these different things up together, providing there are a positive interaction, and explicit support, which is back again, is just these last three questions. The independent variable was primarily mortality salience, so the death prime, and what happened there is that half of the participants were given that mortality salience prime, so they were asked to think about what happens to them when they die, how do they feel about that, and the other half didn't get that prime. Other things that I was interested in, social dominance orientation, and that is basically when you have a preference for hierarchy and dominance in society. The identity fusion scale, which is basically when you are so identified with your in-group that you kind of blur the boundaries between your individual self and your group. Outgroup hostility, and the activism and radicalism intention scale. Activism intention is about sort of legal protests, and radicalism intention is less legal behaviours, more violence. So my first hypothesis is that the mortality salience prime is going to lead to more online engagement and more explicit support than the no mortality salience prime. And that's because there's a lot of research that shows that mortality salience will lead to more in-group bias and outgroup hostility. But I did not find this. And such is the strength of the research for mortality salience prime that I thought that was a bit weird. So I decided to look into it a bit more. And as luck would have it, I had, as part of the experiment, I had to use deceit, because I couldn't very well tell them what I was really doing. And as part of that deceit, I had them doing a memory recall, but really I was asking them to describe the different groups. So they had to describe the in-group, the out-group, and the extremist group. So what I did with that information was to code it as positive, negative, or neutral. And then I used that information to see what they were doing with the in-groups and the out-groups. And what I found was that the participants who described the in-group as positive were also describing the out-group as positive as well. So what I interpret this as being is a psychological distancing from the UCL in-group. So they're accepting the student in-group instead. And that means that there could be no mortality salience effect because the in-group out-group divide disappeared. On the other hand, where people were describing the in-group as negative, they were also describing the out-group as negative. And what I think is happening here is that there's a psychological distancing from the entire student in-group. So again, there's no mortality salience effect because the in-group and the out-group were not being distinguished. So what I think has gone on here is that mortality salience has had no effect, but it's because the material itself is promoting some kind of disidentification from the in-group in its various forms. And that's because the material is providing for the students an inconsistent or negative in-group identity. So if we take that a little bit further, we could suggest that some terrorist or extremist propaganda can actually inhibit online engagement with material and also inhibit explicit support for the extremist group via this process of a disidentification. But I think this is going to really largely depend on the stage of radicalization, and that will be another thing that would be interesting to research, is if people who are sort of more strongly identified or you do sort of agree with the way that an identity is presented by the material, if mortality salience has a bigger effect. So I think there's lots of interesting research there to be done. The second hypothesis was that likes more than dislikes are going to be associated with stronger preference for social dominance orientations, so hierarchy and dominance in society, stronger identification, more outgroup hostility, and more activism and radicalism intention. Likes were associated with social dominance orientation and outgroup hostility, but not the other factors. But I think what's important here is that most people didn't interact at all. So they had the option to like the material, they also had the option to dislike the material. Very, very few people liked it, but only half really disliked it actively, which I thought was quite surprising. So most people don't really interact at all. For the people who did like the material, males were much, much more likely to like the material than females. And people who were exhibiting preference for social dominance orientation and outgroup hostility were also more likely to like the material. People who disliked the material tended to be white, as opposed to non-white. They tended to be older people, and they also tended to have lower levels of outgroup hostility, but this wasn't quite significant the start. So what I think this means is that likes and dislikes can be really useful features for understanding interaction. But most people don't want to interact at all with the material one way or the other. And there are some differences that we can pull out between those people who like and dislike the material. Online engagement, which, as I mentioned before, is like bringing all those different types of engagement together. The prediction varies that it's going to be associated with those same factors, so social dominance, orientation, identity fusion, outgroup hostility, and the ARIS scale. Social dominance orientation was not a factor here, and nor was activism intent, but identification, outgroup hostility, and radical content were. So here are some other factors that were associated. Younger people were more likely to engage with the material. White people more likely to engage with the material, and high levels of outgroup hostility, high levels of identity fusion, and high levels of radicalism intent all were associated with more online engagement. However, online engagement did tend to be low overall, as we've already seen with the likes and the dislikes. There are certain features that we can pull out of in those people who do engage with online extremist material, but it also means that we can start to learn about features about those people who don't engage at all, which is obviously like 70% of the population in this sample. The final hypothesis is that explicit support is going to be predicted by online engagement and all of these very familiar factors by now. And the only thing that was not associated with explicit support was social dominance orientation, which is a bit interesting, and I haven't really figured out why that would be the case yet. I think that's more future research. Primarily, the biggest predictor of explicit support was online engagement. So the more online engagement there was, the more explicit support for the extremist group there was. Linked to this is stronger levels of identification, more outgroup hostility, and more radicalism intent. So what I think is happening here is that with this work, I think I've been able to identify some useful factors for predicting who will and won't engage and interact with online propaganda, and the related issue of explicitly supporting extremist groups online. But I do want to point out some limitations of this study. It was a small sample. I mean, it was a weird sample. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of this acronym, but it basically stands for Western, Educated, Industrial, Rich, and Democratic. So we've got a very specific sample of people here. I mean, they're UCL students after all. And a really important point is that you've got an even smaller number of people who actually interact with the material, which is basically going to be the same for any kind of research you do on terrorism and radicalization. You're already dealing with a very small number of people who deal with this. The final issue is potential ecological validity. So I wasn't able to use like the thumbs up and the thumbs down for the likes and the dislikes. For instance, I had to use tick boxes. So there's potential that perhaps the ecological validity was harmed there. But generally, the participants did believe it, and they were quite surprised when they got to the surprised and relieved when they got to the debrief that said, "It's all right, it's all a lie." In conclusion, the question was how to what extent do people engage with and interact with online extremist propaganda? The answer is that engagement varies. Very few people will actively, positively or negatively or excessively interact with the material. Those who do tend to be young and white. They tend to identify very strongly with the in-group, and they tend to prefer hierarchy and dominance in society. They tend to have a somewhat positive view of the extremist group, and they do show hostility towards the outgroup and also radicalism intention. For those people who, most people won't engage at all though, and those who don't engage in this sample anyway were older, they were not white, there was a lack of identification with the in-group, there were low levels of outgroup hostility, and there was a lack of radicalism intent. So, most people don't interact with the material at all, even if they don't like it. But there are certain features that we can pull out from this material to say that there's some people who interact with it and offer support for extremist groups. And that could maybe start to shed light on the types of things to look at when we're talking about so-called sensitive or vulnerable viewers who might be drawn into or influenced by aspects of terrorist content. There are potentially features of terrorist material that could actually be disengaging and particularly for people whose idea of a social identity is very different to what the material is presenting. But in reality, if you were interacting with this kind of material and it was actually terrorist material, it could lead you to further exposure or even contact with recruiters. And this exposure and contact with recruiters, this radicalisation, is one of the outcomes that the Counter-Terrorism Internet Referral Units and other Internet Referral Units is trying to prevent. So the question for this last project that I'm going to be talking about is how terrorist material online is identified, assessed and removed by practitioners, and what the effects of extensive and repeated exposure to this kind of material has on for practitioners. And I already mentioned before that the process is not very transparent, it is very subjective, and that there are negative health and wellbeing implications, but I will talk about that a bit more. So firstly, just a very little bit of information about CTIU. It was established by the Metropolitan Police in 2010, and its role was really just to facilitate the removal of terrorist material from the internet, and it does this largely in cooperation with big and small internet platforms and providers. It has facilitated the removal of hundreds of thousands of items, possibly even more at this point. They've done a lot of work. But currently it is undergoing a bit of role change, and that's because of the developing AI capabilities of various platforms and providers, but also because these platforms and providers are establishing their own content removal teams. So they have less of a role there, but it's still an active role. How do they identify, assess, and remove the material? Well, it's identified in 3 different ways. So they can actively go and find the material by using various techniques. They have web crawlers. It can be flagged to them by partner agencies and other organisations that they work with, or it can be identified by the public referral system that we have. In terms of how the material is assessed, they basically will view the terrorist material and they will compare it to the Terrorism Act 2006. And there are 3 different elements that are really important for this explanation, for this assessment. So the first is that does the material glorify or incite terrorism in any way? Does it provide instruction for doing the deed? And is it produced by prescribed groups? And what they'll do is they will identify any areas of that material that can possibly overlap with any of these 3 different features. And they'll make a note of the timestamp, or if it's a video, the timestamp and what the specific item is doing to breach the Terrorism Act. And that is a report that is filed and it will go off to the criminal justice system if it's based in the UK. A lot of the material is not based in the UK, which means that the Terrorism Act is not relevant. So what these guys then do is look at the terms and conditions of the relevant website that's posting it, and they'll say, look, it breaches the Terrorism Act in these ways, but it also breaches your terms and conditions, please can you remove it. So that's the process of identifying and removing the material. Why do they do it? Well, because it's illegal to support, glorify, incite, and enable terrorism, or be a member of a prescribed group. But again, want to hone in on this underlying assumption that there is some kind of that online terrorist material facilitates acts of terrorism online. What kind of material are they exposed to? All sorts of terrorist material. They see a lot of horrible stuff, very graphic material, sort of ISIS type material. They also see quite a lot of non-violent sort of grey area material that may not be published or produced by terrorist groups, but still overlaps in a lot of ways. They can't really do very much about that unless it's very clearly breaching the Terrorism Act. They also see a lot of non-terrorist violent graphic material, and actually this can sometimes have more harm than the terrorist material that they're seeing, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But just to give you an overview of the kind of stuff that they see, they also regularly get referred Daily Mail articles by the public. So, and I think an important thing to add here is that this very, very small team of people has to review every single thing that gets flagged to them, everything, including the Daily Mail. So they'll have to read it. They do get a whole host of different formats. Videos, largely the participants agree that the videos are the worst, but they'll also get things like magazines, different types of text, social media, music, images, and they have to engage with all of this material. So in terms of the methodology for this study, I was lucky enough to conduct some pretty in-depth, semi-structured interviews with 11 CTRU case officers. I think there was only like 12 or 13 on the team at the time, so this is quite a good number. I conducted a thematic analysis using NVivo, and I'm only going to talk about 3 of the things here, and that's because there's loads of them and the report is massive, so if you want to look at it, then feel free when it comes out, but there's more things there. So in terms of the stresses, naturally one of those stresses is looking at the graphic terrorist material. I think one of the points that I wanted to make is that participants tend to have quite vivid recall of the horrible material. Not everyone though, so for this participant, she said that she tended to sort of blur all the material into one in her mind. But this particular quote, this particular video really stuck out to her because she has personal significance of the seaside. So the things that tended to really strike people the most is where there was some kind of personal significance rather than necessarily just the gore. So children often featured. If there's like children in their family and there's children in the video of a similar age, then it's going to have more of an effect on them. And I mentioned the graphic non-terrorist material and how this can have more of an effect. And this can be more damaging, and this is what these guys have said. This can be more damaging than the terrorist material because they don't expect it. To an extent, they know what they're going to see. They've already seen so much terrible things, so many terrible things from ISIS. They know what they're going to see. It's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be nice, but they can kind of preempt themselves and mentally prepare themselves. But you cannot prepare yourself for seeing this kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing that you take home with you, I think, because you've got no way to know what you're going to be hit with. And one of the reasons that I think this is quite important is because a lot of the time this graphic non-terrorist material is actually flagged to them by within the organisation. So it's within the Metropolitan Police, and it suggests that there's not a very clear understanding of what CTRU are doing. So the Metropolitan Police are kind of putting their own staff under more unnecessary pressure because they don't really understand what should and shouldn't be flagged. So that is a stressor for them. Another stressor is signs of torture, and this really comes from the COs, their case officers, sort of engaging in perspective taking or really empathising with the victims, and that can have quite a negative impact as well, particularly if there is evidence of torture or the victims just lost the will to live. So typically the kind of videos we're talking about here is when the person could escape their death, their slow, painful, agonising death. They see it happening, but they don't. They just let it happen. And what happens is the COs are mentally and emotionally going beyond what's already really horrible material on their screens and thinking, well, what on earth has happened to this poor person in the run-up to this event? And that could be really, really unpleasant for them. Another issue is that especially when ISIS were really very active, was that there was no escape for the COs. They would have very long work hours where they would just be completely absorbed, usually in videos or the magazines. And then they'd go home, and on their way home, they'd see all of this material on their commute. They'd see it in the newspapers, they'd hear people talking about it, they'd go home, maybe if their family know what they're talking about, they'd be like, so, what do you think? It'll be on the news. There was no escape for them. And this is really important because work-life balance is really critical for people who do this kind of work. And it was really difficult for them to get that work-life balance at those times. Naturally, there is psychological impact when you're dealing with this material all the time. Actually, these guys have done a really, really good job of mitigating the psychological impact, and I'll explain why in a little bit, but they do still naturally experience some psychological harm when they're in the moment. Another thing is that every single person was concerned about PTSD. They're quite happily say, oh, I'm fine at the moment, but I don't know what's going to happen in 5-10 years. When, maybe I'm not going to be part of CTRU anymore, I don't know what's going to happen. Or if I start having flashbacks. And some of them are already having flashbacks. So there is an effect of doing this work. There's a physical effect as well. I'm not going to talk much about this because it's basically, if you sat in an office or just sat down all day staring at a computer screen, you're not moving. So there's physical health issues that we can all probably relate to there. But I think the reason that this is picked up on by these CEOs is that some of them were, active police officers, so they were doing a lot of walking around and physically moving. So this is quite a change for them to suddenly be sat down all day. So in terms of the coping mechanisms, these guys have managed to develop some really, really good coping mechanisms, and they've done that with the support of their supervising officer and their management team. Without that support, I don't know if they would have such good coping mechanisms. So I think that these coping mechanisms and that support has helped offset quite a lot of the challenges and the difficulties that they face, the stresses. The team is probably the most important coping mechanism that they have. They have a very, very good relationship with each other. It is quite a small team. They engage a lot in gallows humour, so they laugh at terribly inappropriate things, but it's kind of something that they need to do to be able to work off the horribleness of the material. They do quite a lot of talking as well, so they do chat with each other, and as I said, they just have really good, strong relationships. The role itself is also quite important. So I found that when they were talking about the difficulties of doing their role, so the stresses, they would also sort of throw in there, but I would rather me be exposed to this than some child who's going to be more harmed than I would be. So there's kind of like the actual role is also a coping mechanism, it's a justification for putting themselves through this. In terms of personal practice, this is another great thing about CTRU is that the CEOs can do whatever they need to do. They can do whatever they feel that they need to do is best for them. And one example of this is where they kind of share the burden. So if someone sees something that's particularly horrific, then they'll just sort of jab their neighbour and say, "Look at this, isn't this terrible?" and probably laugh about it somehow. But that really helps them. But the problem is that some of the team don't do that. They only do what they have to do. So there is also a bit of a potential conflict in their personal practice that's being conducted as well. So I think that they'll have to try and balance their team to keep that particular personal practice going. The final coping mechanism is the individual level. And again, support from the supervisor and the management is really important here. So this guy is talking about how he likes to have, they all have 3 screens, and he likes to have something on his third screen that's a comedy, that's something that's just a bit daft. But other people won't do that because they don't want to form a connotation between the horrible stuff that they're seeing or listening to and the stuff that they like. So it's all about individual practice, and they're all different ways that they can physically interact with the material as well. So a lot of people will have like the headphones off of their ears so they don't really have to listen to the screen. Or maybe some people have a really small thumb, they won't have to look at the video too much, they'll shrink the size of the video. So there's lots of different things that they can do. Identifying terrorist material is not particularly transparent, it is very subjective. I don't see that the repeated and extensive exposure is related to radicalisation, which I feel like I should put that in there, but to be honest, I wasn't looking for it because I kind of assumed it wouldn't be. But there can be negative health and wellbeing impacts. So I'm nearly finished with that here. I wanted to bring you back to this original diagram, which is bringing together all the different projects that are presented here, because they do all interlink. We have the extremist material, which provides information on identity construction. We have viewer interaction and how most people won't interact with that material, but there are certain features about those people who do interact with that material, and those are the people we should probably be worried about being influenced by the extremist content. But saying that, there is elements of the material that could actually be disengaging for most people. So removing it, I don't know, we should think about that a bit more. In terms of practitioner engagement, we know that it's not a transparent process, it is highly subjective. We know that there is negative impact, but for the CTRU guys, this is mitigated by a really great team and some really good coping mechanisms. So I don't know, maybe there's some implication for practice there. Final slide. just to say that I don't think online terrorist material is necessarily radicalizing in and of itself, um, but it might be influencing these processes that underlie radicalization, like social identity. I think there are certain features that make engagement more likely, or at least in this study, I was looking at. In this study, it's that those things that were making it more likely were centering on identity, which I have to say is not surprising because I focus on identity. But if we focus on identity for a minute and think about policy implications, I think that we could be looking more at primary and secondary interventions to strengthen social identities in other ways, perhaps provide alternative opportunities to engage in positive differentiation in a meaningful way rather than just sort of a superficial way. And one thing I think that this research points out is that the justification for removing terrorist material as a way to prevent terrorism should really be carefully considered and objectively considered, actually, particularly because it's really not a very transparent process at this point. Um, and it's potentially fruitless, really, because it is just going to pop up somewhere else. So maybe it's better to, I'm not saying we should not remove terrorist material, but maybe we should also include some other types of interventions, like more widespread interventions, not just focusing on certain groups that are based on positive identities, inclusive identities, and other acceptable and sort of useful ways to engage in social conflict, basically. And I'm finished. Thank you very much for listening to that.
Thank you very much.